Let me start. I wasn't even recording, and this is my brain. This is how my brain has been.
I know. I feel like I can't even think in straight sentences right now.
I know.
Everybody just needs to cut themselves some slack. Like we're up, we're talking, we're cheerful.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
good. Yeah,
Yes.
we're putting our best foot forward. So I'm gonna go again. Jiminy Christmas, Doc. You put a time machine in this machine. Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about antiquity, pop culture, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
And I'm Elijah Fleming.
Today, we're going to be talking about Atlantis, The Lost Empire, Disney's 2001 animated sci-fi action-adventure directed by Gary Trousdale and Kirk Wise. And I'm very excited to announce we are also joined by a guest for the second episode in a row, the wonderful Dr. Clara Bosak-Schroeder from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Clara, we're really excited to have you on board because you were one of the first responses we got back when I sent out my initial query, and I was so excited.
I am a huge podcast fan, and so this is like literally a dream.
Excellent.
Yay!
Wonderful. Well, wait till you're. Yeah, I mean, don't thank us yet. So we'll start. I want to start with Clara first, but we kind of always like kick off by just querying both like what your exposure to this movie has been, like when did you first see it, what was it like revisiting it, and in general, like, do you dig this movie?
This movie has been on my various lists for many years now because the city of Atlantis sort of has popped up in my own research from time to time, but I'd never seen it until yesterday. Yes. I watched it in a very particular frame of mind because of the week that we're having. Yes. And I would say that the desire to love this movie warred with the desire to hate it pretty fiercely, and I'm not sure that I've resolved that tension within myself. So I'm gonna have to give you a wishy-washy answer. But I did dig the experience of watching it, knowing that I would get to talk about it with you guys.
Oh, excellent! That's the best answer yet. We've been finding that too. A lot, like last couple of movies, Eli and I have been like,
awesome.
Yeah, like dig with an asterisk or like maybe, but I recognize these certain things about the movie that I don't dig. Yeah. Eli, what about you?
Yeah, I saw this in theaters. I remember like going with my parents as a younger person and really, really uncritically enjoying this movie. I thought it was really fun. I think I'm a sucker for expedition movies or expedition stories. Like I loved Lewis and Clark in school. I have an unhealthy obsession with the Quest for the Northwest Passage. I love all of those crazy Arctic expeditions. So this was like right up my alley. And I do think that watching it this week, I am embarrassed at how much I dig this movie because I think there are definitely parts of it that make me wince or I kind of like squirm a little bit where I'm like, it's not great. But I dig this movie.
I kind of had, I think, the reverse of Eli's experience because I'm trying to remember back, but I would have been about 11 or 12, I think, when this came out. And I think for whatever reason, I was sort of cooling because we're getting just sort of, I was always a big, and still am in many ways, like a sort of endorser of a lot of the like early Disney Renaissance ones of the early and mid 90s. And this is like a shift in that. And so I, from the get-go, never really liked this movie. And I continue not to like it. And I've basically been talking myself into not liking it for like the last 2 decades. And there's things about it, as anyone who's listened to any episode of this podcast will come to know, that I get hung up on plot points and plot contrivances very easily that can break a movie for me. And this movie has perhaps the ones that bug me most. And then as I sort of got older and like rewatching it now, especially having like gone through graduate school and been really, particularly right now in the field, we're having a lot of reconciliation about our own legacy as classicists in archaeology and history and things like that. I'm like, there's things in this movie that I really don't like, but we're going to get into them in just a second. So the first kind of point I just have on my talking list is just, and Clara, you mentioned Atlantis kind of cropping up in your research leave, just like the status of Atlantis in our like late 20th, early 21st century, like mythos, or like our, like what is Atlantis?
Yeah, I was trying to think about the like other important touchstones. And I know there was a TV series for a while,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like it's rarely featured in depth the way that it is here. And it's actually in the early modern period you get like several works that are sort of take Atlantis as their like point of departure for thinking about utopia. So a question that I sort of have, even though the movie is framed very explicitly with a quote from Plato, is how much Atlantis is not, how much Atlantis is important to this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Given that, especially I know that the creators of it were drawing a lot on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea,
Yeah.
which is itself probably also in dialogue with the Atlantis myth, but it seems like Atlantis was being mediated very heavily by other myths and archetypes here.
Mm-hmm.
And so that makes it, I think, hard for me to assess. To assess.
This movie, yeah, it's kind of like a couple of things because, like you said, it's very Jules Verne, and even the production notes and all the creators have like explicitly said they kind of wanted to do like a 20,000 Leagues Journey to the Center of the Earth kind of thing. Which is I think why it's like set when it's set. It's kind of it's set in 1914, something like that. It's kind of that, and it rubs shoulders. I know, and it has this whole. It's kind of bumps into my next talking point, which is just like about history and archaeology and linguistics and colonialism more broadly. But like it rubs shoulders with that kind of early sci-fi action adventure sort of novels, and then also like my sort of recently reading this movie really rubs shoulders with almost like Ancient Aliens kind of stuff. Like it reminds me a lot of Stargate. It's like almost the same premise as that movie, or maybe Stargate's like this.
I was just gonna say it did make me want to construct a genealogy of what is influencing what here.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, I thought it was, and we'll get to the Pocahontas problem of this movie, but
I have that written down.
It comes 6 years after Pocahontas, which feels like too soon. Like Disney, come on, like didn't you realize this was a mistake? But it also comes about 7-8 years before Avatar.
I was about to say that the next Pocahontas iteration is the Avatar movie, which even then everyone was like, well, I mean, I guess box office loved it, but like, yeah, everyone was like, this is a bit tired at best.
Right, but I feel like so we could construct that genealogy, but also look at how this movie is building on or coming to influence other sort of undersea adventure, lost civilization, lost quote air quotes civilization, type ancient alien movies.
Yeah, I almost wish that they like hadn't called it Atlantis. Like they could have called it any sort of invented fantasy lost civilization, and I think it would have had a very similar story arc. But it's like the Atlantis part is that pop culture-y ancient aliens, like the we don't know the whole story sort of thing. That I think actually gets people maybe into it at first, and that if they had just sort of had this very Jules Vernean storyline, that it wouldn't have had the same pop.
I did like that. I mean, the colonial fantasy of this movie cannot be understated.
Yeah.
But I think there are some interesting, sort of unintended consequences of it. For example, the Atlanteans are brown-skinned.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of several things that I think is supposed to cue, especially, white American watchers to think about, indigenous peoples of North America. But if we're imagining that this is if we take seriously this is Atlantis, it's somewhere over, fairly close to Europe, right? So it's interestingly located. Like it's not Avatar that could be anywhere, and it's not Pocahontas in what is literally
Virginia or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah. It's somehow in between those things. And I actually, given these debates in classics about the way that ancient Greece and Rome are often portrayed as white, there's something potentially subversive if you read really hard against the grain about having these brown-skinned Atlanteans, but it's a big
because the whole like plot is framed in this very imperialistic sort of colonial expedition, very like Heinrich Schliemann-esque, where it's like there's like sort of crackpot academic Michael J. Fox and a sort of benevolent billionaire discovers him or finds it or literally owes his grandfather like a favor or something. So he funds this private expedition with like his own private army, presumably. We can get about like why I have like all sorts of the little things that bug me. Like, why is this like a pseudo military expedition? But anyways, and then it's like there's like it's wrapped up in that sort of like colonial like allure of like going to a strange and new place and meeting people who are usually like darker skinned, and then they find there's some sort of like they have some sort of secret technology. It's so many different things that is like wrapped up in, and I'm already like I'm trailing off with where my like brain is going with this, because it's like you could potentially like I think people have argued that this movie is kind of anti-colonial or anti-capitalist because they at the end they decide to not go with Rourke the villain and exploit these people and steal their life source and like condemn them. But I am unconvinced by that, because the whole thing, like I think Disney does this thing where it's like when there's a villain who's some kind of like banker or rich person or evil tycoon fat cat kind of type, it's always framed against like there's like a good benevolent billionaire, like there's a benevolent billionaire, and that there's like greedy capitalists and there's good capitalists. Like it's not this movie doesn't in any way say like maybe this whole enterprise is like flawed sort of root to stock and root. It's just like there's bad individuals within the framework that like make life miserable, but it's not like nobody ever questions like the wanting to go on the expedition sort of at all, if that makes sense. Or I just went on like a weird rant.
Yeah, so this is why I really struggled with this movie, because it is a colonial fantasy, but it is also more honest about being that than a lot of other movies. And so the fact that you have especially the villain at the end say that he is an adventurer capitalist who's providing a necessary service to the archaeological community is so much more honest and upfront than Indiana Jones or any of the other sort of movies in this genre. And I found that quite refreshing. However, the structure of the film, as you were pointing out, Colin, is in no way really it does not take responsibility for this colonial expedition. And in fact, the characters that do fight back against the sort of leader of the expedition are rewarded handsomely in the end, right? And actually, it if anything, I feel like at the end you're supposed to think that the whole thing was necessary, because the Atlanteans otherwise would have died out if our white savior Milo had to come in to read them their own.
This is exactly what I was gonna say. Yes,
this is my biggest sticking point with the movie is this bonkers notion that it plays with.
Yeah, no, I totally agree that I appreciate the sort of questioning nature that this has for this sort of fantasy of imperial exploration, and I think really forces us to hopefully like look at our own Lewis and Clark, which I, loved in school, and sort of have to have, far more serious conversations about manifest destiny and this sort of idea that, exploring is a service.
It belongs in a museum.
It belongs in a museum. And that's sort of, at the end, he says, like, if you gave back all of the things that you stole from the museum, you would have an empty building. It's like, yes, these are things that we agree, that we say, absolutely, we would have empty buildings, and maybe that's okay. But that's like still a huge discussion. But it is the white savior coming in to read them their own language that absolutely gets me. Yeah.
I kept coming back and thinking, like, comparing this movie and the way like Atlantean civilization is portrayed versus like I was thinking particularly of like Wakanda and like the Marvel and like Black Panther and that stuff. Whereas like that's like and in some ways they're very similar because they're both like secret, hidden, technologically super advanced sort of mystery civilizations, but they're also night and day. Because Wakanda is fine, independent of, they're actually more than fine, independent of the rest of the world. And like, they're better for having not. And then at the end, it's like of Black Panther, they kind of say like, we have to get back into the world and help other people who haven't had this kind of like fortunate that, the privilege basically that we've had in Wakanda. But as Atlantis there, my biggest plot point thing that drives me nuts about this movie is there's like two things going on. So they're both Kida and Leonard Nimoy, her dad, are they are thousands of years old. They were there for they saw Atlantis fall like 8 or 9 thousand years ago, however it was. Simultaneously, they say that their own culture is just atrophying on its own accord. Like everybody's afraid, but like when there's two people living who would presumably know like how to read their own language or like operate their machines and stuff, and so Milo needs to come back and explain to Kida how to read her own language. But then it does that. It plays into certain tropes where like when Kida like says her full name to Milo, he like completely butchers it, which is like this guy's supposed to be the expert in Atlantean language. Like he wouldn't like that is a trope from another movie where like somebody, John Smith meets Pocahontas and like can't say her name or something like that. It's just so incongruous, and it's like this movie's like two movies like Venn diagramming over each other, but that like pull apart in that way.
I also think that there were some, in addition to those inconsistencies you point out, there are also some lost, like missed opportunities. Like if you're going to set up the movie this way, which also has an interesting, it's sort of a very schematic but racially diverse supporting cast. It like one of the other people on the expedition is Audrey, who's a Latina mechanic, and like why isn't she the one that can start up the fish ship? Right, Milo is simultaneously a philologist, master like navigator, and a better mechanic than the woman who was raised to be a mechanic and has
he's got the whole boiler,
right, the boiler room. But like that was an opportunity. Like how would we have felt if this was actually ended up being a movie about Kida and Audrey like teaming up to save the Atlanteans and also hooking up? I that's part of part of my fantasy.
I'm sure there's like I would bet you there's like fanfic and headcanon out there that is exactly that. If I know anything about the fan community in this current year.
Yeah, I think I do feel like this ultimately is very it's an indictment in particular of the academic who embodied by Milo, who is horrified by the system, this colonial system he's joined, but is completely surprised by it and takes no responsibility for his part in perpetuating it. His sort of uncritical, apolitical stance to being an academic is really
this is where we live.
Telling, yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you guys what you thought about the art, since I know that that's another big, a divisive point about this movie. Some people love it and others hate it.
I think when I first saw it as a small child, I was like, cool. I sort of didn't see, I guess, a whole lot wrong with it, but I guess I go back and forth because I feel like they were trying to sort of be maybe sensitive to very complex, wonderful ancient cultures that do very interesting things with like the full masks and the kind of weird like glyphic rock art, which I think is very cool and interesting, but also maybe just a little watered down in this and could have been more cool. I mean, they created a whole language for the movie. I wanted like a little bit more, I guess.
I feel like in like a lot of like sci-fi and fantasy, when they're creating sort of whole cultures, there's like the lazy avenue, which is like just take two pre-existing cultures or a pre-existing culture and just like riff on that or something like that in like kind of a derivative way. And then there's other that sort of like I think a little more deeper about like why things might look or take the shape or like given like the resources and the whatever sort of cultural historical influences there might be. I'm trying to think of like a good example. This is probably a niche, but I was thinking like there's the game Horizon Zero Dawn, which is I can't even begin to explain it, but there's like an art style in this game of like this civilization. It's kind of like it's robot dinosaurs, like it's far in the future, but it's also like kind of like Stone Age civilization because they've lived like after the apocalypse. So there's like robot dinosaurs, but they have like it's sort of like there's like this one city that has this I think really compelling art style that's kind of more the former I was talking about. And this, I think the notes say that like the buildings and the art was very much, I think, influenced by like Mayan, but also Southeast Asian. Like it's kind of Angkor Wat and also Chichen Itza. There's definitely like a sort of Easter Island kind of, was it Rapa Nui? Like the big idol kind of heads and things like that. And I'm not sure where I fall, because it's sort of like it sort of seems like a lot of creativity when I think one of I'm going all over the place, as is my want, but like the 2 points of praise I feel like that you recurringly see with this movie are, one, the supporting cast, which I think we can get back to, and two, the art style. And just like, I think there's a lot of like technical and animation advances that happened in this movie. Like there's like shots where they can pull out and have these big swooping panoramas that are like, from a technical standpoint, very, very impressive. The Atlantean culture, I don't know where I fall on it. It feels a little bit like we kind of have been saying, it feels like very much indebted to like this sort of colonial like age of just like exploration in, say, like South America or Africa or Southeast Asia. Like it's indebted to that in a way that feels maybe unoriginal, but I'm not quite sure where I fall. I'm still making up my mind.
Yeah, I think I'm with Eli that I just wanted a lot more world building here, just because that's what I crave.
Mm-hmm.
And also there were several, in addition to some sort of mixing of iconography that you pointed out, Colin. There are some specific references to indigenous people in North America. So Cookie, the sort of prospector figure, fascinating supporting character, says at one point when the Atlanteans like gang up on them, and he says, I seen this back in the Dakota. They can smell fear just by looking at you, which is like, it's such a complicated utterance, because it's really I think we're supposed to be critical of it. Like this is a racist comment, right? They can like this weird stereotype of like magical sensing powers, but it also just it so clearly shows the connection between the experience of genocide in this mass genocide in the United States, and how this is being then applied in an exploration quote unquote context, right? So it's like it's another nice little link there. But then there are things that I couldn't really make sense of, like the fact that Sweet, the black doctor, like, he says that that one of his parents is an indigenous person. Like, what are we supposed to make of that? In terms of like reading the racial politics of the movie. I will say, just on the animation, I think this is the thing I like the best about it, and the reason that I think I stayed. I didn't dismiss it out of hand. I thought it was so beautiful, and I know that the animating budget was cut tremendously at a fairly late stage, and I wish that we'd been able to see the full vision. But the style, the sort of sketchy comic booky 2D style of the characters, especially the way their faces were animated, they sort of ripple. It sounds weird, but there's a lot of mobility in their faces that I don't associate with Disney. I thought was gorgeous. Also, Helga is possibly the sexiest cartoon since Jessica Rabbit. Like she knocked my socks off.
Yeah.
Totally
agree. So that
I'm Santa Claus. I came down the chimney or whatever. Like whatever her opening line is.
She has that big like fur stool. It's like
she kicks ass.
Absolutely.
It's funny the art. I'm glad actually, Claire, you brought that up, because the art style of this film just generally is like very unique, I think, among Disney, particularly like Eli and I just were talking about Hercules, which has it's like night and day the way those movies are animated.
Although one of the Hercules illustrators worked on Atlantis, so they saw them as connected, or they wanted.
Interesting.
That is interesting, yeah.
But the art style in particular, I think, I don't know, I forget. I think he either worked in consultation or it was based on, but it was based on Mike Mignola, who's the Hellboy comics creator, and I think it really shows. If you look at like old Hellboy, there's like a, not like jaggedness, there's like kind of an edge to it, and like the way their hands look, they have like in like the kind of the sharp angles. A lot of the characters are I think it's got a really distinctive visual style,
for sure.
And again, this movie this I think ties into everything we're talking about, but this movie also, compared to other Disney movies, I think is really directed at like a young, and I assume, and I'm almost 90% sure, young male viewership. which is funny because that was me when it came out, but I didn't like it at all. But it's like the t-shirts for the production team said less songs, more explosions, or something like that. Like it was designed to be a more action adventure PG-13. And this movie has, Eli and I were just talking, Claire, before you came on, the body count of this movie is wild when you think about it.
Yeah, because they're all the army guys that die up front, right?
Mm-hmm.
Astoundingly.
Which, and is there a ship called the Ulysses? Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Which is a kind of a nice another allusion. I read that apparently they wanted there to be a much higher body count and were told to take it back a notch. So there were supposed to be more explosions, more monsters, more guns, a lot more guns. And there are more guns in this than I was expecting. So
yeah. I think in what I was reading about, like in the production, in the early drafts, there was a lot more of. It's funny because we talk about we want more of Atlantis proper, but in the original draft there was more of the like journey. It was more like a Jules Verne thing where they were like traveling underground and navigating past like different monsters and obstacles, and a lot of that got hacked out so they could basically because they get to Atlantis relatively quickly, I want to say.
Yeah, it doesn't take that long. It doesn't feel like it drags, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh no, because then going hand in hand with sort of like the visual design of I think Atlantean culture is like we said, they invented a whole language. They got Mark Ockrens, who's famous for he invented Klingon, and I think of maybe the Avatar language. And from what I learned, that Atlantean language, it's based sort of the word stock comes from Proto-Indo-European, but it also has like Mark Ockrent I think does Native American linguistics, so there's a lot of Native American I think grammar and also Sumerian grammar, and the idea of like an language. I thought that might be something we can talk about because that has definitely come up in our field.
I there were some weird moments with sort of outdated notions of how languages work, or just wrong things. Like, I mean, I like both don't want to be pedantic, and maybe that's the point of part of the point of the podcast. But like at the very beginning when Milo is explaining that the manuscript isn't in Ireland, it's in Iceland, and just the way that he shows that is like it demonstrates a lot of ignorance of the way language works.
My partner that I was watching it with, she's a linguist. She does French linguistics. And when that happens, she just starts screaming. She goes, "It's a code, not a language," or whatever.
But maybe this is this is one of these things that it's like, well, maybe, it's 1914. So maybe this is actually a sort of a weirdly historically accurate.
Yeah.
Not the sort of mistake or error I just alluded to, but like the idea of an language, I'm sure was pretty in vogue at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right that it's perpetuating this, and that like viewers are not going to be able to tell the difference. Yeah,
there's a whole. So go for it.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I think on the subject of Atlantean culture, I thought, they went in so we don't get a lot of Atlantean culture. We have to fill in a lot of gaps, but there are numerous allusions to Native Americans, which we've mentioned, and also including the fact that Kida is voiced by a Cree woman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Cree Summers.
Right. Yeah. And so that's sort of, I think that's what we're supposed to be filling in with.
Mm-hmm.
And that really is quite different. I think they could have gone in a different direction, actually, by using Plato, who describes in detail the sort of the type of culture that exists, and like the stratification and the sorts of monuments that are being built, and none of which is incompatible with Native American or First Nations cultures, but it's not part of the stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
However, there is this eruption, I think, of a more Platonic idea of Atlantis in that moment where they arrive and the Atlanteans start speaking all of their languages. So they're polyglots, and I feel like that's something Plato's been like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That actually shows up in Greek utopian narratives. This idea that people who live in the best places, they can speak multiple languages, or their Diodorus Siculus talks about people on the island of the sun who have forked tongues, and this allows them to speak more languages.
So awesome.
Better, right?
That's wild.
Yeah, I sort of, though, I almost wish that there had been that more tension between like people who do not speak the same language and sort of having to maybe go through the one or two people in their groups that can communicate, and how like much tension that can build, and how like things can be misinterpreted, and mistakes can be made, and like how you negotiate with a new culture that you're not familiar with. I think I've always wanted to see that in a story, because I think it's a little bit more realistic, right? About, people whose cultures have come together in the past, have been like, how do we talk? How do we communicate? How do we, tell each other what we want to say? So I've always wanted to see that in a movie, and I kind of wish there'd been a little bit more of that.
Yeah, I think it would have better, just from like a storycraft standpoint, it would have justified Milo's sort of existence a little bit more. And like
I
my
agree.
sort of take is either they did the thing where they explained it both simultaneously, not enough and too much, where like had they not said anything, we might not have ever questioned it, because there's plenty of movies where people who have no business speaking each other's language
Yes.
will just, everybody speaks English in fantasy world. But then the explanation they give is like drives me up walls, that they can sort of reverse engineer, because they speak this like utopian origin language, they therefore can understand English and French and Spanish and whatever, Latin, I think, crops up very briefly.
Hmm.
Which to me, just even as like, I think a young, like as like a preteen, I was like, that can't be how it works. What else do I?
You mentioned the supporting cast. Maybe we can
Yes,
talk about them.
yes, that is actually exactly where I was going to go. I think, yeah, so one of the, I think, side effects or benefits even of this movie not being a musical, where there's, it frees up more space for thing having like an ensemble cast like the way it does. And I think like most people, when they remember this movie fondly, they primarily are thinking about the supporting cast, like Audrey, and it was Audrey, Sweets, Cookie, Miss Packard, and who am I forgetting? Vinny.
Moliere.
Moliere. Oh, Moliere. I don't know what to make of Moliere.
Oh, he's my favorite,
He's
100%.
always been my favorite.
So weird. He's also quite lecherous, let's say.
Yeah,
Um,
putting it
which
nicely.
right. So I feel like that wasn't necessary. Like they just wanted to have a another male to kind of ogle Kida, but I don't feel like that was really necessary to.
No, he was
It's because
like,
he's French, maybe? Is that the idea?
Yeah, he's French. So we got the French, the Italian, the Northern European older prospector, right?
Mhm.
The Latina, the black man who's also indigenous. Yeah, I was surprised. I was like, huh, you could have, I would have expected, let's see, an Irish
Yeah.
person. I would have expected more varieties of white people.
mhm.
Um, and I actually thought that the little that we get of their backstories is fascinating, and the way that, in a way, I almost wanted them to not join the cause at the end and just double down and be like, we are marginalized within this society. We need to get paid. Screw you, because I feel like that would have been quite honest. Of course, they get to be both ethical and rich at the end, which is very
Yeah.
nice. Um, yeah. So what? So you said you like Moliere.
I
Do you
do.
like? Do you have other favorites among the
I
supporting cast?
I love Vinny. I love the demolitions expert. He's so like like soft and tender on the inside and explody on the outside, and something about that just kind of touches my heart. I love that.
He represents a particular approach to archaeology. Like Eli, when you go on your digs, you're just like you're dynamiting stuff left and right, and you
Of
get in like a
course.
big drill.
I do think it's telling that like my favorite characters are the sort of more straight up dirt archaeology, maybe we could call them. So Moliere, he's like, I want to dig. You said there would be digging. I want to do stuff. And then Vinny's actually, like blowing up stuff to get places and do stuff. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, I like that. I mean, it's obviously a part of archaeological history that we used to do terrible things with dynamite, and it's something we really had to reckon with. But yeah, I think they're great, wonderful funky little characters. They make me happy.
I think something Clara just said that reminded me. It would have been, I think, more satisfying just as a viewership, because like this movie is very sort of male wish fulfillment, and that the fact that Clara was saying like Milo basically gets to do everything, and it's sort of, but like it felt like there should have been a little bit more that each character like had some sort of like unique thing that they alone were capable and skilled and had the expertise to do, and also not just the sort of supporting expedition, but Kida especially, because Kida is, as a character, I think my least favorite aspect of the movie, because she's a convergence of a lot of the plot problems I have, but then also the problems I think with the way this film sort of like almost gets into an interesting treatment of basically a non-male or non-white character, and then just kind of doubles back down on Milo, because she's kind of written out of the last. She literally becomes a sort of art piece for the like colonial expedition to sort of exploit.
Yeah.
I think she was also the least interesting to look at. Just the way she was animated was like not. There was something about her that seemed somewhat sort of smoothed out. The other characters, they're grotesque at moments. It just depends on the way that the way they're moving. And even the ones that are like I think supposed to be beautiful have moments where their features are rent. And I felt like Kida was a little bit more static.
I've never I think pulled that apart, but I think you're exactly right. That makes so much sense, because like even Helga, who's like sort of dripping with sex, is sort of like has this like furrowed brow and it's like this angry face. And Kita's just kind of blank almost. Yeah.
She combines, I think, like several problematic tropes of like female characters in movies, where she sort of is like simultaneously like naive but also very wise. Like Milo kind of has to explain stuff to her, which is absurd, because if anyone would know, it should be her. She not only is sort of Atlantean, but then lived through all this stuff. She's 8,000 years old. I don't know what to make about that. It's like massive age gap.
I know,
but she's just a girl. She's just a girl, so it doesn't matter. And he's a philologist, so it all it's funny though. It made me really want to revisit Avatar, which is a movie that I have a lot of love feelings for, in addition to the hate feelings. But there, the dynamic I think is actually a lot healthier, where the Nazi princess, whose name I'm forgetting, is the teacher, like is the educator of the white male love interest.
Yeah, and Sam Worthington, like he's like a child. Like when he first comes up, he has to be like he's so. And I think that movie, that movie is again like another Pocahontas dances with wolves kind of white savior complex.
Well, and that's a problem too. That the sort of you have the like wise, essentially crypto Native American culture, right?
Yeah.
Like that is itself a problem, but it was a little less absurd than what we saw here with Milo, explaining things to this ancient woman.
It just makes me have so many questions about like the various lifespans of different Atlanteans. So it's like, is everybody that, like, her father is obviously older than she is, but like how old is he? And there are children in the Atlantean universe, and like how old are they? Like how many children do you have a year if you all live for like thousands of years?
This is the kind of thing that like I said was driving me, because like I think a lot of my problems really they come back down to the crystal, the magic crystal, which I think is just a crappy trope sort of in general. But like I have like this list of like plot contrivances and gripes of that, and like 90% of them revolve around the crystal. So like there's this vague sense in the movie that Atlantis was this like global technological superpower, and then they did something, like they were conquering or building weapons or something, that Leonard Nimoy's character was. He kind of mentions, I think, at one point that like we were making super weapons, and that's what led to the cataclysm that destroyed our society. And then what I think we're supposed to take away is that consequently Leonard Nimoy like shut it all down and decided to go into like an isolationist state, and then everybody sort of collectively forgot how to like turn. I mean, by the way, also like the thing that like Milo's explanation for how to drive the fish ship is like you literally just have to like put your hand on it and turn it clockwise, and like they couldn't have figured that out in 8,000 years, and
Right.
the whole thing. Like it really is just like the crystal is so hand wavy explained over like what it is and how it works that for me, like the movie, just even from like a plot standpoint, like falls apart because, like Eli said, is Arkita and her dad the only two super old Atlanteans, or are they all that old? Have they all just the same exact people have been living down here, frozen or something for like thousands of years?
Oh, like, I was just gonna say, if Milo stays, is he also gonna live for thousands of years?
Or is he just going to be like a drop in the pond, like he's going to die in 100 years, and Kita's going to be like, all right, I guess I just keep living now. It's like
I mean,
Arwen and Aragorn or something.
I do want better for her, so I sort of hope that's the case. But we're told at one point that the crystal like increases longevity, so I'm afraid he's probably
Ah,
gonna stick around. For a while.
darn.
Yeah, I was curious. This is another. I had heard that there was some sort of ecological kind of subtext to this movie, and that was another thing that made me curious about it. And the fact that the commander is and Helga are they're motivated to go. They want the crystal because it's a power source, and they want to sell it to the highest bidder. Subtext in World War One.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right, and so that's sort of ups the stakes, right, for this. And it made me curious. That's obviously the plot of Avatar too, where you have like a ex-military expedition to go and get unobtainium,
Oh my gosh.
which is a power source. At least it didn't have a dumb name like that here.
Yeah.
But it made me curious. Like, is this how is this the first iteration of that trope? Like, where can we trace this back to? And also in terms of plot points, like presumably Prescott, the old billionaire, he hires the commander and Helga, right?
Yeah.
And assembles this expedition. So like, it made me very confused. Is he in on it? Does he want the crystal too, because at the end he seems to be supporting the other characters in their mutiny. I feel like that was not filled in. There isn't a moment where the commander kind of goes off the rails and decides to, disobey his billionaire patron. Right?
I think I'm not to defend this movie, but I'm gonna make in a devil's advocate. I'm gonna take on my devil's advocate. But like, I think the idea is they just expected there wouldn't be anyone down here, so it would have been a non-issue. They would have just come down and like found the crystal, taken it back, And I don't know. Actually, I don't know if Prescott. What do you feel? I don't know if but you're right though. I don't know if Prescott was in on the weapons sale aspect of the thing.
There are other indications too that Milo's grandfather, right? He whom we see in a photograph is wearing a military medals and a pith helmet, which Milo literally takes and puts on his own head.
Yeah. We got a link. Sarah Bond just had that article about pith helmets. I feel.
Yeah, exactly. That was a big thing on Classic Twitter. The whole vintage colonial aesthetic. So again, it's just like these curious moments that are like so upfront. It almost feels kind of refreshing.
Mm-hmm.
But also in a way that it's clear that the creators are not at all truly critical, because they make allusions to like when Vinny demolishes the first column, and Milo is like, oh, it took so long to build, and then he demolishes it. They make allusions to, it's sort of a joke, right? It's a funny moment, and they make allusions to, well, we never hurt anybody before, we just robbed graves, and they'll, oh, maybe that did hurt somebody. There are these sort of glancing references to the ethics of archaeology at this time.
Yeah,
but it's not explored, right? It's not explored, and it's not, there are no consequences. In fact, these grave robbers are only rewarded in the
end. Yeah. Because it's certainly something that we very much take very seriously now, working with descendant communities, and sort of, if you excavate burials and tombs nowadays, it is extremely, at least it should be, extremely respectful to any descendant communities that do claim that ancestry. And even if there aren't living communities, I've worked on a few huge cemeteries in Sicily, and it's taken very, very seriously. It's like, these are human beings, and no, maybe we're not hurting anybody, but I've so glad that we archaeologists have, climbed out of that. Well, it didn't hurt anybody that we knew of sort of mentality, because it's not great. It's not a good look.
I wanted to ask you, Eli. I mean, so you've moved out of that, right, as an archaeological community, but culturally we have not moved out of
Absolutely.
the image of the archaeologist, at least not by 2001. And so I wanted to ask you whether there have been what you would consider, responsible representations of archaeology in pop culture that could counter what we see.
I really don't know if I have a good pop cultural reference for respectful, appropriate archaeological practices, because I think we don't maybe see. It's going to be a very weird tangent, but Jurassic Park.
You say more.
Yeah, I am intrigued. Continue.
Yeah.
Are you holding out? Is the archaeological community sitting on Dinosaur Park? Is that what you're telling us?
No, I wish. We're doing podcasts.
Tell Nick to get out of here.
Colin says get out of here. At least, okay, so I'm thinking of the very first Jurassic Park movie. The very beginning, the guy's like, oh, it's just a big lizard. Like, what's the whole big deal? And he's like, you have to have respect for the creature that this was. And sort of this was, something that lived on this earth and fought and tried to survive and would, very much hurt you, a small child. And that sort of thought process to think about, even that is, not even another human being, that is another creature that does not exist anymore today, except in birds, but that you still
turkeys.
And turkeys.
Looking at you, turkeys.
That you still sort of have this thought process of this is a living creature and it deserves our respect. And yes, we are looking at the remains of it, but that doesn't mean that we can, disregard its life and its existence on this planet. And I do wish sometimes that people would sort of think about human burials maybe a little bit more, with a little bit more of the respect we might have for ancient dinosaurs, right? So if these were people who had loved ones, who had thoughts and feelings, who sort of existed in this world, and we absolutely need to respect and sort of see ourselves in that very much. So I realized that was a very weird tangent.
No, I love that. I love that as a starting point. And of course, ultimately, the past isn't past, and it bites back, right?
Absolutely, yes.
It was a better answer than I was going to give, because I was my pithy response was going to be, I think in Rural Tenenbaums, Angelica Houston's running like I forget, she's running some kind of archaeological dig in the city that I don't know what it has to do.
That's funny. I haven't seen that in so long.
Oh, I was just going to ask too about one of it's very painful for me in movies to see animals being hurt and antiquities destroyed. Like, those are the things that really get to me. And we have some of that here. And I actually was thinking about how that's a big part of the genre. Actually, is it's not just that the explorer is indifferent to destruction, right? But that's actually, I think, supposed to be part of the pleasure somehow. And that is nicely embodied in Vinny, right? Who really wants to blow stuff up, and also in Moliere, who wants to dig. And I think that was kind of also a nice moment of like just being really honest about what's driving this type of behavior. But it's also a big part of the sort of the action hero genre. And I feel like I would be really remiss if we finished this podcast without referencing the Atlantis in the DC comic book world.
Yeah.
With Aquaman, of course, at its head.
My man.
And there, of course, like, superheroes are constantly going into museums and just smashing stuff, which drives me bananas. But I wanted to ask you, this is sort of a roundabout way of getting at this, whether you've seen the most recent Aquaman movie, and if Atlantis is, like, what that Atlantis is like compared to this one, because I haven't seen it.
I have seen it, and I truly feel like I blocked out a lot of it. I did not super enjoy it. I thought it made it very cartoony and garish in a way that I wasn't expecting. I feel like from the trailer, Aquaman was sort of like dark and gritty, and it's just sort of this more maybe like realistic Aquaman. And then in the movie, all of the underwater scenes are like very bright and loud. And I mean, it's definitely a difference between on land and under the water, but it struck me as sort of cartoonish in a bad way, and I don't know, it didn't jive with me. I didn't like it.
Yeah, I saw it. It does a lot of weird world building where it's like it's the movie I would just say like generally is bonkers. But like there's this whole like Game of Thrones esque element where like the evil guy is trying. There's like different kingdoms of Atlanteans, and some of them are just like people, and some of them are like fish people, and like there's a whole the bride. Sorry, I'm thinking of another podcast where they go off, and one of the characters is called the Brine King, and he's just like this giant crab man. But they it's the question is it's kind of similar. I think it's almost like a crappier Black Panther because the kind of central issue is the Atlanteans, like the main evil guy wants to like become the king of Atlantis so he can wage war on the surface world, and because they're like polluting the world and they're bad and destructive, so he just wants to take them all out. And that's like it's just kind of weird. It doesn't have that. It's completely sort of removed. It's more like they're kind of more like Wakanda, where they're like super advanced and isolationist by choice. But I was also reminded I watched a little bit. There's a DC TV show called Young Justice that's like the Teen Titans, and one of the characters is Aqualad. But when they go to Atlantis, I have nothing really good to say about it, except when they go to Atlantis, they actually speak ancient Greek in Atlantis. And
That's
like
cool.
not just ancient Greek. Like I was watching, I was like, holy crap! And they say like because he calls his Aqualad is like talking to Aquaman, and he calls him Wanox, which is like the Homeric word for king. And I was like, whoa! I was like, that's kind of cool. But they actually speak Greek, and I think this movie deliberately wanted Atlantean culture to like not be Greek, because again, I think they were going for that kind of like we were just saying, like it's very heavily influenced by like Native American, and especially among other sort of non-white cultures, but. That was just like there's just like a weird little plug in Young Justice where they actually just speak ancient Greek for like a little bit.
I have been watching with my husband Batman: The Brave and the Bold, which I believe is more or less at the same time as Teen Titans. I feel like the Aqualad shows up, and but Aquaman is one of the best characters in that show, and he's just he's very kind of original Thor in the Thor movies, like just full of himself and kind of over the top and very cheerful and extremely blonde. So if you're looking for an Aquaman palette cleanser, I recommend.
Awesome.
Our podcast is gonna take a right turn, but I'm all for it. But like, because Aquaman just as a character is like fascinating and weird, because he like for much of his early creation, he was just kind of a joke. And like, even in like DC, I think it's like Super Friends or whatever, everyone's like, it just kind of like Aquaman's like, he talks to fish and it's silly. And so he's been like the butt of a joke for like decades. And then in the 90s, they really tried to like make him badass. Like they cut off his hand and he had like a hook for an arm. And he was all like gritty. And and then like now, so they're trying to make Aquaman, like they cast Jason Momoa, who's this like super cool, like jacked, like intense guy. But yeah, there's Atlanta. I mean, Atlantis is like, even just like in like modern fiction, it's sort of, what am I saying? I'm losing my train of thought. It's like it's a well we keep returning to, I think, for better or worse.
I oh gosh, now I'm losing my train of thought. I was interested in how, especially comparing to Aquaman's Atlantis. So it's similarly to that when you have sort of Atlantis is in a bubble, right?
Mm-hmm.
But here, the bubble, we get two bubbles. There's the force field that comes back into
the literal bubble,
right, to save them from the volcano. But then they're actually in this pocket of air under the earth, right? And I thought that was so interesting because that they really have no relationship to the ocean. They're not sea people. Although Kida does seem to be a good swimmer. And then you have their fish, their ships that are shaped like fish, sort of steampunk aircraft. But that's quite different than like Aquaman can, communicate with the creatures of the sea directly, telepathically. So I thought that was kind of an interesting decision.
Yeah, you're right. I never noticed that until be like, you're right. Although there's like aquatic imagery all over the place in Atlantis, they themselves have no particular. Except there's that sea monster that protects them, which is another. I'm like, I don't get the sea. Like, who made the sea monster and like why is it there?
Right.
I
Oh,
think
and then also, yeah, I thought it was weird that we didn't get a reference to that. Like, oh, Leviathan's still working. It's still
yeah.
it's still
Still
out there.
going.
I think it's never explained, but my sense is that Leonard Nimoy put it there to
Uh,
keep Atlantis in its bubble. I think, but that's never actually. Again, I think I'm like doing the movie's work for it because that's never quite explained.
I loved the colossal metal men who guard
So
Atlantis
cool.
and pull out the force field, and that's another sort of a nice classical reference to figures like Talos, who's
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
made of frogs created to guard various places. I thought that was a really gorgeous.
Yeah,
Yeah.
same.
What was I gonna say? There was another of the Lebanon thing. Just the other my other my. I mean, I gotta like stop being so pedantic, but like my question is that there's they have a book that I think is from the Vikings or someone that is a map to Atlantis, but like how did that book come into it? How did the like how did the how, whoever wrote this medieval book how did they get their way to Atlantis?
Okay, so here's the thing, Colin, is that the original intro to this movie was supposed to be all about the Vikings finding the book. And then they realized,
Ah.
like, this is now a movie about finding the book, and that's not what we want to do. So,
Mhm.
so there's sort of an editing issue here, I think. But I like that the book ends up, like, there's a question of how it gets to, sort of like, who writes it, how does it get to, how is it in Iceland? It's not in Iceland initially, right? The Vikings have to bring it there. But I actually quite liked that it ended up in Iceland because Iceland has a lot of medieval manuscripts that survive because of the conditions there, the climatic conditions. It's actually a great place for preserving stuff.
Just so
So I
cool.
felt like that was sort of a nice little detail. Yeah. But that doesn't answer any of our questions about this.
No. And a larger sort of more just thematic thing we were talking about, but you mentioned like Atlantis being is in this bubble, and then the decision at the end of the movie is basically to leave them in the like bury the secret, don't let the world know it's too and like do you guys have any, I just want to know, do you have any thoughts about the idea of like letting them, because I was sort of thinking of like the example that kind of jumped to mind is like Japan spent hundreds of years as sort of an isolated country and then was forced to reopen by gunboat diplomacy, but the idea of like should like this sort of there's like sort of an ethical question of like leaving them in isolation and things like that. I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts about that.
Eli, I think you should go first as an
Okay.
anthropologist.
Okay. I sort of think if they're self-sufficient, they're obviously sustaining themselves. I would assume that even if you are thousands of years old, you have to eat. They have that whole sequence where they eat with all of the Atlanteans. So they can obviously provide themselves with food. I guess this is the weird question of, their culture actually dying and like whether or not contact with the outside world would just accelerate that sort of eradication as it does with a lot of like indigenous languages that maybe two or three people still speak and they have no one to pass it on to. So I think in some cases isolation can be helpful for communities that can self-sustain and that can sort of keep themselves going. And I'm thinking of tribes in the Amazon that have no outside human contact and sort of we don't have the same immunities to a lot of viruses, things that are going around, and that contact with them would be very harmful, and that they are self-sustaining, and that is sort of a part of their protection against the outside world is being isolated. So I think if that is their choice, their culture's choice, then that should be respected.
I like I think that's a really good way of looking at it. I like the idea though of the Atlanteans sort of becoming a world, like a danger to the world or a world superpower. And this is something that is very important in the Platonic account, and also actually alluded to at the beginning of like in the movie, right? That they, you know, Leonard Nimoy says that they, they cared too much about war. They wanted to go to war. There was some sort of investment in war, right? And then, as you said, Colin, he tries to shut it down. But what if, now that it's not shut down, like, what if they decide they want to, rejoin the rest of the world, and with this power source, like, could they potentially conquer it? So the movie is not set up that way. The movie is set up to make us think that they're going to be the victims of European powers in World War One. But I think we could imagine a counter
for sure.
And this is not I think this is a way in which this is a culture that is quite potentially different than, say, the Na'vi and Avatar, who are very explicitly sort of set up as like peace-loving. I mean, they're hunters, right? But their relationship with Awa, their relationship with their life force is about harmony and communion.
They're imbalanced with nature at all
times. Right, like that's the whole point. Whereas the Atlanteans, the relationship with their power sources is quite different, right? And it might actually lead them into war and imperialism. And I do wonder then that whether that somehow authorizes the expedition against them, that this war, that sort of warlike people who screwed up their civilization are now like, sort of the prey of another warlike civilization. I'm not sure. But it does create some I think some complications to the typical tropes around people of lost places.
Yes,
yeah,
for sure.
Lost,
I think I only thought about it because it was really like just I keep coming back to Black Panther, but like that kind of throws it into sharp relief because that's almost the exact opposite, where it's like they can help us, and it's them sort of coming around to like there's a lot we can provide with this amazing. But Clara, you're totally right. There's like, is there that? And there's also like just anthropological and like political science, like thinking about like this culture that was once so super like a sort of military superpower has presumably gone without war for thousands of years, and then now and also like you also said that the rest of the Europe is on the brink of World War One, and like what would it mean to like if this technologically advanced culture sort of came out of the woodwork with a superior power source and things like that. I don't know. I mean, I think maybe my just hot take thesis on this film is that this film introduces more interesting questions than it is prepared to answer itself.
For sure.
Which is, I mean, that's in a way a great boon to interpreters like us, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot of meat for us to dig into.
That's right. Yeah, but it does seem pretty unintentional and beside the point for the creators.
All right. Well, I think we've not to hit it up too nail on the head, but we've excavated this quite a bit.
Very good.
I'll pay for that later. Clara, do you want to? Where can people find you on the internet, and what should they read about you?
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. You can follow me on Twitter at Saumatic. That's CHAUMATIC. And at my website, theburningboy.com, all one word, theburningboy.com. I also coordinate an organization called Chris Antiquity that advocates for neurodiverse people and people with disabilities in ancient societies broadly. And the only other thing I have to say is thank you so much for a truly enjoyable conversation and a great respite.
Yeah. No, thank you. You've elevated the normal level of our conversation to hitherto unknown heights.
Nonsense.
All right. Thank you so much.
Have
a good evening. Take care.
Okay. Bye.